Great to be here. Again, my name is Frank Correo. I'm the digital marketing manager at Good Old Active Web Group in Hauppauge. We've given a lecture before here. You might have seen my face around giving lectures through various other organizations. The one we did previously here was a very robust, bulky presentation. It was a 360-degree approach to digital marketing, everything from start to finish, which is a lot to get through in 45 minutes, to be quite honest. So what we've done here is we've broken the workshop up into 4 weeks throughout November. The first 3 weeks we're going to go over, starting with this one, is branding. So we're going to talk about your 360 brand approach from both tangible and digital aspects. What everything from a logo, how it should exist digitally, some things you should look at from typography. This is a fun presentation where we're going to be more visual, more of a visual vanguard presentation. So this is a bit more creative. From there, we're then going to talk about SEO and pay-per-click and some other digital media assets. We're then going to talk about web development, web design, best practices and best approaches. And finally, we're going to look at some case studies in the 4th week. And that's going to be a lot of going back and forth with you guys to hear about what you do, what you're looking to do, what your goals and objectives are, really try to hone that path. So it's going to be more of a workshop thing where we're going to have some back and forth. But for these first 3, we're going to have more of a presentation-based approach. Without further ado, this is the digital marketing workshop. This first one is about branding. Okay, so branding. Everyone hears the term brand from logos, tangible collateral and assets, to things you see on the website. But what really is a brand? What are the things that equate to a proper brand? So a brand identity system, along with a logo system, encapsulates a lot of things. It's not just having a pretty picture that's a logo, and we're going to get into that later down in the presentation. But there's a lot that you have to think about in terms of your brand. Your brand essentially is a personality. So people inherently look at your brand, how it exists in the market space with its own personality against its competition. So is it a friendly brand? Is it fun? Is it playful? Is it serious, methodical? What words come to mind whenever I think about your brand or your brand structure? So asking a lot of questions about your market space, who you are, what you're about, who your target audience is going to be vital in putting together your brand. Once you're able to ask and answer those 3 questions, then it's time to move on to some fun stuff like tangible assets like trifolds, mailers, brochures, building a website, having an email campaign, having a logo, very important there. But without asking the questions, who you are, what you're about, why you're doing it, and who your target consumer is, I wouldn't start down that rabbit hole yet. So when I think about a brand identity or brand system, I think about the behavior patterns of my brand. What is the language? The language is 2 things. It's visual, right? So your visual language or your visual identity, your system of iconography or icons, your color scheme, the button on your logo, the button on your website for Call Us Today. What color is that? That should always be the same color. So coming up with a system and a language there is important. And your language as in the way you speak to your consumer. So you have your mission statement and your tagline, but when you're starting to communicate and ideate concepts to your consumer, how do you do that? Do you speak in a more fun, engaging tone, or are you very stern and serious? Your language falls in tune with your behavior patterns. And then your mission, as I said, your mission statement. You have your vision, which is your tagline alongside your mission statement. Your culture. So what are your cultural attributions? Do you give back to the community? What is your team environment like? Then we get to design, which is the ideation of stuff tangibly and intangibly. Your communication as you exist. What does your inter-team communication look like? But what does also your communication with the consumer look like? And then you get to your logo last. Okay, so as it used to exist, we had things exist tangibly, as I call it. I call it tangible design. So tangible design being, I'm going to put an ad in a local newspaper that may be the size of a business card, or it may be the full back spread of a magazine, right? I'm going to go put 5,000 trifolds on a stand somewhere, or I'm going to pin my business card up to something. I have an every door direct or EDDM direct mail system that I do. Versus what happens more nowadays. Nowadays, you deal a lot more with digital marketing as opposed to tangible marketing. The good news about digital marketing, as we're going to talk about in subsequent meetings here, is the ability to understand your ROI, your return on investment, from your spend allocation. So if I am spending X amount of dollars a month on emails, I'm going to know who's coming into my website from emails, who's clicking on the calls today, who's filling out a form, who is buying something directly on my website. Whereas with the newsstand approach or the tangible approach, I'm just going to throw trifold brochures out there and, maybe ask for a source, right? So the good news about what's going on today, while it's more complex and robust, the staying the course on it and dialing into what really works is much easier than it used to be 10 to 20 years ago. Okay, so when we think about a brand, the first thing I like to talk about is colors, right? There are a lot of colors out there. You see a lot of playful, fun colors, and then you see a lot of very green or brown or muted colors and tones. That is done with reason and purpose most of the time. So certain colors will mean certain things, right? So you have yellows like Best Buy or Hertz. That signifies being optimistic about your approach to business. And also it's playful and fun and airy. It's bold. You put it on a black background. It's very stark, so you could see that logo right away. Then you have your friendly column, which those are a lot of playful. You see a lot of stuff in the kids arena. You see a lot of things in the more edgier brand approach, like Harley Davidson, but you see things like Nickelodeon, Hooters is a good example. So you see a lot of them more in a more edgier tonality approach. Your red ones, of course, build excitement. They're very stark. Those ones feel more larger in the market space, and you'll start to see that with some of the examples I have here. You got some big names, from Target to Nintendo, Coca-Cola onward. Creative ones, you see a lot of purples. The same with trust blue. So there's a reason why you see a lot of law firms, doctors' offices who use a lot of blues, because those build trust and they're dependable. Peaceful, growth, and energetic, you usually see as greens. John Deere, you see a lot of supermarkets that will use green. Whole Foods is a good example here. Tropicana is another good example on the growth arena. You see that with a lot of organic products that are green. And then ones that are more neutral patterned and stark. These are more avant-garde, calm businesses, ones that are balanced, and ones that kind of feel a little more modern to a degree. Okay, so when we start, again, talking about color, I'm using Active Web Group here as an example, which happens to be my favorite brand. So when you think about color, you're not just thinking about your logo mark. There's a couple things that happen here. One is, of course, you have on the brand mark itself, you have that little dot of orange that gives you a little bit of identity. We're playful, we're fun, we're interactive, we're Active Web Group. So you have that green, that orange right there. But then it's important, as I said, your buttons. So when you're thinking about brands and brand systems, it's not just a logo. There's a lot more that goes into it. Here, for example, everywhere you see a button with a call to action or a CTA, request to quote, contact us. If you scroll down this page here, you'll see some more of them, right? But you have every single one, it's always orange. It's always going to be orange. This way, the consumer will expect whenever it's time to talk to Active Web Group, I'm going to click that orange thing, right? So creating a system and approach for your consumer to interact and engage with you, and creating a system for that will be helpful in terms of conversion digitally, but also will be good for you if it's tangible, right? They have a thing called highlighting for life in design. And you probably have seen this in commercials. You've probably seen it in physical print. You've seen it on the web. There are a couple brands that have done it over the years. And what it is essentially everything is monochromatic, whether it be black and gray or grayscale. So you have an image of a mom and a kid playing, right? And that image is grayscale, but then the toy itself is colorized, right? That was done because they're trying to signify what they do is they sell toys. So having a system and approach for that to ideate your concepts to your consumer will be helpful here. And again, your color approach is going to be vital. Now, something else that's going on here in terms of design, without getting too heavy on the design aspect of it, is what we call the rule of thirds. So from a visual perspective, your eye is going to bounce around a page looking for somewhere to land, right? A lot of times when you were talking about an ad, a physical ad, you'd have the rule of thirds. So you'd have something up top, something in the middle, and something on the bottom to kind of lead your eye and guide you through the page. The same is true on the website. So here where you see I have that dot, I have the request to quote, I have the contact us, I'm leading you down the page. So keep in mind, you could tell stories with color, okay? Now let's talk about typography before we start to get into logos, which is the fun part, right? Typography I see is, it gets bastardized a lot. A lot of people tend to, just go and find some free font or free type family and throw it up, and maybe it looks good, maybe it doesn't. There's a lot of bad things in that exist in typography, and this is a much harder concept and design to understand than people give credit for. There are three main types of font families. There are serifs. These are fonts with brackets, so they have the feet on them. These serif fonts you usually see in a more serious brand. A law firm would be a great example, where I'm sure you've probably seen a serif typeface used as their logo. However, what you won't see a lot is you won't see when you get into body copy, whether you're reading a novel or a newspaper, a lot of times you won't see typography that's large pieces of copy that are a serif. That's because it's a little harder to read when you have large bodies of copy. So keep that in mind when you're building your website, or you have like a brochure or something tangible. Now, with that being said, sans serif is the one without brackets. So these are more playful, fun. They could mean a lot. They could be bold. They could be stern. They could be thin and light. Everything from a Futura, Helvetica. There are there's infinite typefaces at this point in the sans serif family. And these are most commonly seen, for example, in this presentation. You see it in most of the brands, not going back too far back onto my presentation, but most of those brands there that we've talked about, everything from Nickelodeon, Nikon, Nintendo, John Deere uses it. Most of those brands are sans serif brands. And then, of course, you have these decorative ones, which I don't necessarily recommend for a logo system. You could take a typeface that pre-exists, like you could take a Futura, you could modify it to kind of feel unique to your brand system. I wouldn't recommend downloading a free decorative typeface like this silly one here and using that. That does go without saying that a lot of these things, the same with pulling an image off the internet, which is a big no-no. You have to get the proper rights for these things. So if you are going to start to take your logo system that exists with some kind of decorative typeface that you got from a freemium website, however, there's a rights management system if you're going to use that for commercial licensing. You have to know those things because you could end up with a cease and desist or an email, an extortion email. I've seen it happen time and time again. So make sure you're getting the proper rights for these things if necessary, if it's applicable. Okay, and actually, let me go back for a second. So with that being said, with those typefaces, using like-minded typefaces will help you. So if you have a brand, an example is Active Web Group. Our tagline is dynamic marketing strategies. Those typefaces are similar but slightly different. That is done with purpose and intent because the two could kind of live on their own. And the same is true. So if you have a serif typeface for your, let's say your Correo and Ford. Scott Ford is the CEO here at Active Web Group. Correo and Ford law firm, attorneys at law, right? If we're Correo and Ford attorneys at law, that would be our serif typeface, right? Correo and Ford. Attorneys at law would then be a sans serif typeface. So we're using two different types of fonts to kind of get the job done, but making sure they work together to build visual interest. Okay, now hierarchy. Hierarchy is an important rule, like the rule of thirds here in design. So hierarchy for us is used to guide the reader onto what's the most important element within a website, a tangible brochure, your business card, whatever it may be. Having proper hierarchy is important. You can do hierarchy with a lot of things. You can do it with color, as we just described, with the buttons, that follow you along the page, the most stark thing that exists on the website. You could do that with large typefaces, like I'm doing here. I have a large chunky, I think it looks like a Helvetica. You're using a large humanist typeface to kind of convey a message, right? Where you have smaller type below that, which has your headline and then your body copy. So having a hierarchy system is going to be important to kind of tell a message to a consumer. An example would be on the website. So you have your hero image or that top image that exists on your website. The example is the one on Active Web Group that I showed you. Now that one, as it exists, there's an element of hierarchy there in a headline and then some subcopy. So we're telling a story. Even if you don't dial into any of that subcopy, you're at least going to quickly grab that headline. And that headline should quickly encapsulate who you are and what you are about. Digital marketing solutions, emergency response plumbers, 24 hours a day, something like that. So make sure the first piece of messaging is in tune with who you are and what you're about, but also, and we're going to get into that when we talk about websites, but also having a system of hierarchy will help tell the consumer quickly who you are and what you're about. Okay, something else for typography, which is very important. And then from there, we can start to move on from typography and get into logo systems. But with typography, and I see this all the time, there are three important things to know. There's kerning, tracking, and leading. So the kerning of your typeface is the way your typeface or your font exists spatially left to right. So here you see I have the R and the N, and that almost makes an N because I have some tight kerning. And then I have what's called a river. So there's between the N and the I have too much spacing there. And I know you've seen this in signs and things that should have spelled something, but then it looks like it says something silly. But that is something to be realistic about. A lot of these typefaces, especially the free ones that you get, when you type them out or you put them on something, if you're gonna print something, professionally, and it's not something that's done in the Word document that you're gonna get done at Kinko's or something. If you're getting something professionally, you want to make sure it looks professional. So having proper kerning with the proper spacing so the words could be read is important for you. Now, this is for a headline where it says kerning. But if you look at the body copy here, you start to get like the A and the N almost forms what's called a glyph now because there's no space in between it. Paragraphs kind of gets tight because what we're trying to do is we're trying to rag and the rag is the copy the way it exists, flush right or flush left, depending on which direction your copy is being written. But here it's so it's flush left, rag right. This is our rag. What they're trying to do here is they're trying to fit the rag into a certain space, so they're letting in and out the kerning of the sentence. This way they fit it within there. You commonly see that in newspapers and editorial, which to a degree is fine. There's a whole system to that. But if you don't have to do that, don't do that, especially on the website. You're better off breaking a sentence. You're better off giving some room to breathe. Because a website naturally is going to be responsive to what you're using, whether it be a mobile device or a laptop computer or a desktop computer or even an iPad. So just make sure you're giving ample amount of space for the consumer to read what has to be read. And if you can't read the paragraph, then you maybe need to loosen up the kerning. Now the leading is another one, and this one is fun to play with. So the leading here explains, so in this example, it looks like I am, looks like I'm what's called set solid. So let's say the typeface is 12 point, my leading is 12 point, right? This one is much tighter, so it's not set solid, it's probably negative. It's a 12 point typeface, so it may be like a 10 point leading, right? So having your leading here will kind of help you tell the story and give enough air to tell that story. This one to the right feels very rushed, right? This example, blah, blah, blah. Whereas this one, I have enough room to tell my story and let some air out. Feels more poetic in a way. It feels more modern. So starting to finesse your type treatments this way will kind of help tell that messaging in that story. And again, since the one on the left feels very light and airy, it feels trustworthy. It doesn't feel like I'm reading a lot, whereas it's the same amount of words, right? It's the same sentence, but this one here feels like there's a lot of words jam-packed into there, and I might get some fatigue and not read that sentence. Whereas this one, all right, let me see if I can get through that one. Finally is the tracking. The tracking is very similar. So that's the two of them combined. What happens is if you make things too tight here, you're just not going to be able to read anything. It's not going to be legible. And again, I see this all the time in editorial. I don't see it exist too much on the websites nowadays because you have a lot of things that are responsive and your type wants to be live. It doesn't want to be something that's embedded in an image. And we're going to talk about that next week in SEO, why. But you want to make sure, again, the stuff is legible. And here's an example of really bad kerning. Again, there's plenty of funny examples in signage and other things, but here's an example how it almost looks like two different words, right? Now, if this was part of your logo system, you know, this is a huge miss to have printed everywhere and pay $10,000 to put a sign on your building. So just make sure that everything is legible, the spatial relationships between letter forms are proper. Because you have to think about letter forms the same way you would think about an icon on the logo. You know, an example there would be the let's go with the target circle. So that target circle, those two little the inner circle and the outer circle. You know, you want to make sure that spatial relationship exists the same left and right. The same is true with the font or a typeface. Okay, and the next thing I want to talk about with types and fonts and all that fun stuff is all this cute stuff that people tend to do. And again, this is more of a visual presentation I'm giving today. We're going to talk about how it all works together starting in week 2. But here, I see silly stuff like this all the time. So what we have is a color map or a color gradient, and then we have a drop shadow. And the drop shadow is done very starkly. You know, it's almost like they put everything to the left. Now, you don't need to do that. If I always say if you need to incorporate a drop shadow into something, or you need to have a shadow or a stroke on your typeface or on your logo mark, that means you have a contrast issue. So the background, if the background is black and then your logo is a dark gray or your typeface is a dark gray, there's a contrast issue, right? That creates problems with ADA when you're looking at visually impaired things on a website, which, you know, we're going to get into when we talk about websites, but that also creates a problem in just your overall system. So make sure you have enough contrast in what your typeface versus your background. So black on white, you have white on red, etc. You just want to make sure there's enough contrast ratio there so that you don't have to do funky things like this. People try to come up with solutions when they don't essentially know how to solve the problem visually. So avoid this at all costs. And this is something I used to see a lot. I'm seeing less and less of, but I still see it from time to time. So don't get in the habit of doing stuff like this. This is a better example of how it's done, and it feels a little more modern. This approach was done as part of a logo, as part of a brand system. So a lot of the stuff is kind of meant to feel like a paper, with a relief, if you will. So they're playing with textures and tones and things. So here's an example where you could take the rules and you could break them in design. But if you don't feel comfortable about breaking those rules, just don't break them. Here's an example of a button as it exists, right? Now to the left is a really bad way of making a modern button. So it looks like there's an outline, there's a heavy drop shadow. They didn't need to do all that. If you look to the right, it's a lot more clean, modern. It looks good. You can read it. You're not getting what's called vibration from the one on the left. You know, with the black and the blue are close in tonality, so they vibrate a little bit. And then you kind of get a little you feel a little odd about it. Maybe you're not going to click on it. Maybe it's going to affect the consumer somehow. These small things will affect your conversion rate, which again, we're going to talk about when we start to talk about conversion ROI marketing. But these things do matter. I know this from many years of experience that they do matter. So make sure less is more in design. Less is always more. So you don't need the stuff to the left in order to kind of get people to click on the button and see the button. And then as an example, remember the dawn of the internet, what we used to call jelly buttons. Those were the worst things of all time. But this thing is a good example of bad design. Again, there's an outline for the button. It has a gradient. It has like a pillow emboss effect that feels plasticky. It's embossed on the typeface, and then it has an outline and a drop shadow. Just too many things happen in here. Again, less is more in design. All right, so let's move on to talk about logos, which is everyone's fun favorite topic. I will say self-branding, as a lot of you guys may embark on, is a very hard thing to do. As someone who spent years as a designer, it's very easy to, it's not very easy, but it's easier to brand someone else's business or interests. It's harder to do it for yourself because you take yourself a little too seriously. You don't give yourself that ability to play, as I call it. So with that being said, though, having a system or knowing what you want will help you. Choosing and picking your colors, looking at inspiration, having what's called swipe in our industry or a mood board in other industries, that will help you. Looking at what already exists in the industry. Of course, you don't want to steal anyone's solution, but if there's a system that already exists within your industry that's expected. An example was that law firm one where I see a lot of law firms will use a serif typeface, more of a Times, London Times or Times New Roman. That will help you. That'll kind of steer you in a direction. So getting steered in the direction is helpful. And a lot of people will say that the first solution is always the best. I disagree. It takes a lot of trial and error. You got to swing the bat many times to get the right answer. With this stuff. So don't be deterred if it doesn't feel or look right at first. And less is more. If you look at the Active Web Group one, our logo is very simple. I want the logo to look just as good as the billboard on a billboard as it will on a business card or postage stamp. It needs to be legible just the same. I will say that your masthead, your icon over here, which for us is a squiggle with the eye, the dot, that is your masthead or your piece of iconography. That should be able to live on its own. I like to take the squiggle, for example, and use it in other assets. So it will exist on the background by itself, in like a 10% transparency on the background of the website of the website or a trifold brochure or something. So I'm leveraging the system that already exists. The orange, I'll use it for points of interest, just the dot, on places that it's bouncing around a page or something like that. So taking your logo and making it able to break apart, that people will be able to say, oh, that masthead, that simple icon, I understand that as being Active Web Group. And then I see the whole system together, right? And then you have your brand name and your tagline, which should exist. So all three pieces could exist together. You can break them apart and they could exist separately. The one thing I will say with your icon, your piece of iconography, don't get so creative with it. Less is more. Again, when you start to get into too many gradients and things like that, that's going to create a problem for legibility when it's really small. And it might not look as good when it's really big. Let's say you might not be putting a billboard on Times Square anytime soon, but let's say you're doing a trade show and you need like a 10 by 10 backdrop, which is common, or like you need to put it onto an apron because you're doing a demo day or something. So making sure your logo looks good in both cases is always the best. The other thing I will say is having a modular logo, and it's something I'll get into when we start talking about web design, but your logo should be able to be stacked, and also so it should be vertical and horizontal. So I could take Active Web Group, I could put that here, so it's to the right of the icon, and it still exists and feels like the brand just the same, or it could be on the bottom, depending on the way your website is built and what that visual system looks like, the way your navigation flows. That might call to change up and break up the way your logo exists, on a business card. So you want your logo to be modular, dependent upon the asset in which it's being used for. Okay, there are many commandments to logos, but I think I kind of talked about a lot of them. So again, keep it simple. Don't add too much tone to your logo. Okay, so you have like a gray tone that's close to black. Again, that's going to create a contrast issue. And then when you go to the design this thing on other things, it's going to make it that much more difficult because you're going to have to find that one Pantone or that one tone that works, in tandem with the two tones you have that exist. So don't create like a duotone system. Have a logo that looks good as one color and then add a secondary color once it looks good in grayscale. Don't use rasterized images. So rasterized images are things that are low res. Your output for this needs to be a vector file, an SVG, something like that. Typically done in Adobe Illustrator, one of those tools. You don't want to do this in Photoshop and then make a 72 DPI JPEG or something that's going to look pixelated. Your end output needs to be a professional logo done with a professional program. So don't do this in PowerPoint. Your logo should be scalable. I already talked about that. I talked about not using too many colors. We talked about the fonts. You don't want to use too many fonts. So I said the 1 or 2 is best. I would usually keep it to 2. You have your brand name and then your tagline, and then all your subsequent treatments can follow that. So all your headlines are the same as your brand name, and then all your body copy is the same as your tagline. So you're just sticking with 2 font families. Never outline your logo. Never outline anything. Never outline type. I don't ever want to see that. Don't outline any type. Again, that's a contrast issue. So you want to solve that issue. You don't just want to outline your type. It's going to make it illegible. It's going to make the weight of your typeface. Your typeface has a natural weight to it. If you start to add a stroke or an outline to it, it's going to puff it out, and then it's going to be harder to read some of those letter forms. Like let's take a lowercase a, right? The lowercase a, I don't see one here, but a lowercase a, even an uppercase a. So you have this ascender here, this ascender mark, which is that area of the a that cuts out, right? That's gonna, if you add a stroke to that, it's gonna puff out, and you're not really gonna be able to see that in there. And then is it an A? What is it? Is it another letter form? I don't know. So don't outline your type. Don't write on your logo. That should be without saying. So don't take your logo. Here's a good example here in this Premier Contractors. But you don't want to put your name brand within something, within a container shape, as I call it. So this mobile ink one here, it's in the phone. Don't put it in a container shape, because you're restricting the size and the scope of your brand mark. You know, let's say it has to be that small. Now I can't read who you are. You kind of limited yourself there. So don't let your typography exist in a container. Avoid putting in a box is what I just said. Don't put it in a container shape. And lastly, flat doesn't necessarily mean it's cool. And that's true. I personally like flat design. Flat design means it doesn't have any gradients. It's very simple. Active Web Group is a flat icon mark. It's a flat logo. However, you could use subtle gradients or things of that nature to make it work. You could break these rules. That hello again example I showed you is breaking all the rules, right? But you have to know the rules and be able to orchestrate the rules before you could break them. So if you're not comfortable with it, don't break them. Just stick to what's simple and what's easy. Okay, and let's talk a little bit about logo trends. So like anything in design, you know, things are circular. 20 years ago, you know, those large pants, those Jenko pants are pretty popular. Now I'm seeing them again. So things are circular. Things come back. Bell bottoms came back. Records are back. So things are circular. Things always come back. What we're seeing now is we're seeing a lot of high contrast, fun and playful design, and things that are modular. And I'm going to explain all these words. And things that that can exist in multiple forms but say the same thing, right? I gave you a couple examples here. I gave you Greatland, I gave you Ham Drags, and I gave you Made in the USA, right? So there's the first one to the left, the color is irrelevant, right? It's just loud colors. That's who I am as a brand. We're just loud. Now the color of my icon is always the same. It's this off-tone gray with a little bit of blue, it looks like, almost like a slate color. But the logo lockup changes, right? So Ham Drags, Ham Drags, Ham Drags. However, I know who you are as a system, right? Because you're loud, you're always in a lockup to a degree. They are breaking some of these rules here, like existing in a container shape, right? A lot of these are, but they're able to do that because their logo isn't tightly locked to one system, right? So if it needs to exist outside of a container shape, it can. The Made in the USA is a good example. These things, you know, you also have to know your format. I don't think the Made in the USA logo lockup, the whole system here is called a lockup. I don't think the whole logo lockup is going to be a billboard anytime soon. I think it's meant to be a small stamp on an item or object. So knowing where your logo is going to live, or your iconography, your icon system, that's important. But here, you know, they're able to take it and be modular about it. And Greatlands did the same thing. It could exist in a container as a stamp. It could exist outside of it. So I'm seeing a lot of things that are utilitarian in a sense. But again, less is more. If instead of creating a whole bunch of systems, get one system down properly. The Greatland brand is a good example of that. Once that system feels good, Then from there, if you need something that's special, specific for an event or a type of co-branding or something like that, then you can start to think about different ways of approaching your logo system. Okay, I'm going to get into some other things that I've talked about tangible design. I've talked about intangible stuff. We've talked about icons. We've talked about mission statements, taglines, competitive analysis stuff. We've talked about the logo, colors, fonts, type families. Let's talk about something that exists online, and that is reputation management. And this is the question I get asked time and time again as a digital marketing professional is, Frank, I have some bad reviews on Yelp. What do I do? Or Frank, how do I get reviews on Google? Frank, how do I set up a Google My Business profile? These are important things. This is part of your brand. The way, as I said, your consumer interacts and engages with your company or business, that is part of your brand and your brand management. More often than not nowadays, it's happening digitally. So the bad news is, more likely than not, if somebody has a negative experience with your company, they're going to put a review rather than if they have a positive review. They're just going to get their coffee, it's delicious, and they're going to go home. If they get their coffee and then there's a hair in it, they're not going to be happy. So reputation management and being able to manage this is important for you in terms of ROI marketing. Let's get into it. Okay, so reviews. Now, 72% of your average consumer trusts online reviews. That's pretty big. 95% of those who have an unhappy experience are going to respond in some way to a review, and it's getting more and more. That number sounds heavy, but it is true. Whether you are in a message group on Facebook with your friends, or you post a negative review on Google or Yelp or one of those review sites, you're a disgruntled employee and you go on Glassdoor, a lot of these negative reviews are more commonplace now than they're not. The bad and good news is that most consumers do check reviews. And I'm sure everybody here does. Whether you're purchasing something on Amazon, you look at the 5-star reviews, you look at the 1-star reviews. Is this real? Is it not real? Are all the 5-star reviews bought? I don't know. What do? I'm going to buy it and get home some cheap China product. Understanding how the review system and process works, depending on the platform, is going to be important here, but being able to foster great reviews is also important. There are many review platforms and sites. It's almost endless now. And a lot of them are very intuitive to who you are as a brand. For example, if I'm an emergency response plumber, something like House might be something that I get, or Trustpilot. Google is a common one. Google My Business. I think the first thing anyone does nowadays is they'll go and Google the business if they're interested in the services. So I'm interested in roughing in some plumbing in my add-on to my house, for example. I'm going to look for 3 different plumbers that are local. I'm going to look at their Google reviews. I'm going to check out their website, maybe do a little social media browsing to see which one's the best. And then when they get me a proposal, you're probably going to have one light bid, one medium, one large in terms of money. And then I'm going to weigh that with the reviews and see which one I should pick. So the online reviews have become an important part of the buyer decision-making process. And that's why I mentioned this in the brand deck here. Now, negative reviews, I always say, if you get a negative review, and you're going to get a negative review, because if you're in it to make money, there's going to be somebody who's in there to deter you. Negative reviews, it's always important to respond to a negative review. Make sure you promptly respond, you apologize, you explain to them the error of your ways. Never, I see this a lot, where a business will go in and they'll be accusatory of the person giving a negative review. This goes into with always assume that your consumer is right. They're always right. They had a bad experience. How do I write that bad experience in the best possible professional manner? Whenever you go and see these negative reviews, or you're just looking for reviews, if you see the ones that 1 star, 1 star, 1 star, 1 star, terrible customer service, hair in my soup, etc., you're not going to go and eat there. But if you see that there's a couple of negative reviews, but then the management promptly replied, and then they said, please come back for XYZ. We'd love to treat you right. This is what happened here. If there's some explaining, that might right the ship. So always respond to your consumer, good or bad. Positive reviews, though, are not as easy as getting negative reviews. If you want to get negative reviews, I don't have to have a further discussion. They'll just happen on their own. But if you want to get a positive review, a lot of times you have to foster those positive reviews. So a positive review you could get it from as simple as putting a QR code at the point of sale, the POS, where someone scans it. Once they've had that interaction, right? They're more than likely to do that right away. A give to get is the old staple in marketing, right? You give them something to get something. Download our white paper and give me your contact information so I can nurture you. If you scan our QR code and give us a positive review on Facebook, Google, or Yelp right now, you'll get a free appetizer or something. So asking for that and doing a give to get right there is helpful. If you use your email marketing system to foster great reviews, that's helpful too. That is a good way to nurture your consumer. So you send them a newsletter, you send them another email just about what's happening around the business. Your third email for the month is for a great review. I'd also say that if you're in like a long tail business or service, for example, I'll keep using the plumber one, or Scott Ford and our law firm that I just made up. So our law firm, if we've worked with this client for a year, getting that review at the end right away, sending that as the first email, please review us. Here are the links to our review platforms are great. Now there are systems. We have one, it's a reputation management system where we can send out emails, and then you don't know if you're sending out blast emails, if one of those people you're sending an email to is a disgruntled employee, or it's a competitor, or someone who did have a bad experience, and now we're just opening ourselves up for bad opportunity, right? So what we could do with that is we have a system that we filter out anything below a 4-star review so they won't get published. Having that buffer there is helpful rather than just giving a link to your Google My Business or Yelp profile, because you're just kind of leaving yourself open. But with Google My Business or GMB profiles, these are optimizable. So these could be optimized, but they're essentially setting them up is very important, especially if you are a business with a storefront. You want to have it set up. Google will probably go and set it up for you if you don't set it up. So you want to take ownership of that so you can control your own destiny. You can say what hours you're open, any promotions going on, you're closed for Christmas, your unique value proposition, your mission statement, your tagline, wink, wink. You could put a great image of your logo that isn't rasterized, which we talked about. You could put your special imagery that's true to your brand. So being able to own this is important. And then what we do is we have Google send you a postcard. You get a code from there. We get the code, and then we go and optimize the Google My Business profile. So make sure you get and own a Google My Business profile. If you have any questions, please email me. I could gladly help and walk you through that. And the same is true for any of those platforms, those review platforms, Glassdoor, LinkedIn, Facebook. You want to take ownership of that stuff. You don't want your consumer to own it because it's going to become like the Wild West. Now, I will say that a company like Yelp or somewhere else, I do get a lot that, Frank, I'm getting a lot of negative Yelp reviews, and they're showing up when you first Google my name. So I Googled Correo and Ford attorneys at law, and the first thing that pops up is 10 negative Yelp reviews, right? But I have 10 positive reviews. What the heck? I'm not going to get into that, but there are ways to push those down. That is done through an SEO campaign, in which we would take some other elements that exist on your website to push that up so that all the negative stuff kind of gets pushed down to the 3rd, 4th page of Google where no one's going to really see it. So we bury it. But that is a process. Don't get yourself there. Start getting great reviews now, and it's not something you really have to worry about. Okay, and that is essentially my presentation on branding. As I said, branding is a lot more than just a logo or some colors. There's a lot to think about in terms of the mechanics and the inner workings of your brand, your messaging, your systems and approach. And they all are going to kind of work hand in hand in the next couple of weeks and in the subsequent presentations. So when we talk about SEO, pay-per-click, your copywriting, the way that exists, what's your messaging and what is your language, that stuff's going to be important. And then when we talk about your website, that stuff's going to be killer important. So understanding this is going to be very helpful for you guys, even if it's not something you're willing to tackle. As I said, when I start the journey with any client who's interested in reaching their goals or fast tracking their goals with professionals like us. I always like to educate them. I don't want to leave them in a lurch and not understand the words that I'm saying. So if all you take out of this is some lingo or some verbiage, that's definitely a good thing.